Before we get into discussion about the Cynefin framework and its relevance to software testing, it would be helpful to have a fairly quick overview of the framework. And as you can see on the screen, it looks as if it's a simple 2x2 quadrant, and I've carelessly described it as being a quadrant in the past, but that was rather sloppy because it isn't. It just looks like one. It's a collection of 5 domains that are quite distinct and clearly defined in principle, but they're all, well, they blur into one another in practice. And in addition to these 4 domains that look like cells, you've also got that messy brown space in the middle that's a fifth domain. That's called disorder, and that's important for understanding the framework. Cynefin isn't a categorization model. That would be implied if it were a simple matrix. You don't drop data into the framework and then get on with the work. Cynefin provides a way of helping us make sense of the problem that's confronting us to give us a better understanding of the situation we face so that we can select an approach that will be useful. The first domain is the one in the bottom right-hand corner, and that's the obvious one. And when you're confronting an obvious problem, there are clear and predictable causes and effects. The second domain up in the top right-hand corner is the complicated one, which is very similar in principle. It also has definite causes and effects, but here the connections aren't as obvious, and you need an expert. You need expert knowledge and judgment to pick an appropriate solution. The third domain is the complex one, and here you no longer have clear cause and effect. You might be able to discern it in hindsight. That doesn't help you predict what's going to happen next because the system's continually adapting and changing. The fourth domain is the chaotic one, and when you're confronting a chaotic problem, you need urgent action. You haven't got time for any reflection or careful analysis. You're into firefighting. You've got to act and sense feedback and then respond. A complex situation might be suitable for safe probing for experimentation to teach you more about the problem, but that sort of probing and experimentation is a luxury when you're in chaos. You've simply got to act to stabilize the situation. So appropriate responses for all of these 4 domains are different. When you're in obvious, the categories are clearly defined. You simply choose the right one, and there is a best practice that you can follow. The idea of best practice has been widely disparaged in context-driven testing, but it does have its place in very particular circumstances where you have an obvious and clearly defined problem. When you're in the complicated domain, there isn't any single right answer. There could be several valid options, and an expert can select a good route through the maze. There are good practices, but there's no single best practice. The idea is misconceived, and that applies even more so when you get into complex. What's essential is that you probe the problem and that you learn by trial and error. The practices that you should follow will emerge from that learning process. And in chaos, as I said, you have to start with action. You're firefighting. You don't have time to worry. You've simply got to act and to take control. That 5th domain in the middle it's called disorder, and in a sense that's the default position. That's where you find yourself when you don't know which domain you're in. It's in a sense the normal starting point, and the danger is that you head from there to the domain that isn't appropriate. That doesn't fit the problem. It's the domain that you're most comfortable with, the domain that fits our training, our instincts, the company's culture and traditions, and that might be really quite divorced from the reality of the problem. These different domains have blurred edges. You know, on any project, for any problem, there might be elements that fit into different domains if they're looked at independently. That's not a problem, and you can use Cynefin to understand these individual problems as well as the big wider problem. And it's important to remember that these domains are not fixed and that you move from one to another. And part of the attraction of Cynefin is that it helps you to understand that process of moving from one to another and understand what you need to do in the complex domain to move into the complicated domain where the problem might be easier to manage. So now that I've given a quick run through these 5 domains of the Cynefin framework, we can maybe move on to talk about how it can actually be applied in practice and how we found it useful in our own careers for understanding what's going on, and also why we've been attracted to Cynefin, how it caught our attention.
In many ways, systems thinking and complexity theory are not the type of thing you can overlay on top of one another. You can choose to look at the problem from 2 different approaches, but systems thinking by definition does have some dependency on there being cause and effect and causal loops. While as when you start getting into looking at complex adaptive systems, and a lot of the work that is coming from Cognitive Edge and from some of the other academics in this area, they're speaking more of ecologies. They're speaking more of being living with uncertainty comfortably. And I know that a lot of the times when people are looking at the Cynefin model and saying, well, how would you apply it? Are you in this domain? Are you in that domain? That is a pretty strong simplification. The Cynefin model itself is very useful as something to actually ground people around the conversation. But where I think this becomes extremely valuable in the software world is the ability to sort of plan around uncertainty with comfort, plan around, work with the uncertainty that is inherent with building software, and actually look to apply the appropriate methods based on where you are in the discovery of innovation. And are you at the point where you actually have converged on something that you intentionally want to build in a certain way, or are you at the point of discovery? It's more about the framing that in a way that doesn't make people really uncomfortable. I don't know, Ben, if you want to kick in on this.
Yeah, so I think people tend to start off with the framework kind of as a categorization model, and that's okay. It kind of helps you get into the headspace of the different sort of ontologies that exist in Cynefin. But as you become more familiar, I think there's this sort of dawning realization that moving between the domains and the how of that movement, as well as the boundaries in between them, are a really interesting space to understand. And so whilst you can sort of say this particular problem belongs in that space, it's highly likely, particularly if you're playing in complex or chaotic, that you don't want it to stay there. And so the how of moving it sort of over towards a complicated place where you understand the variables and you can sort of start to put constraints around them such that you can exploit them. That becomes the more interesting part of Cynefin, I think.
To piggyback on what both of you are saying, I think it's interesting to note that these ontologies don't just exist in Cynefin. There are a lot of different theories of performativity that I think really inform specifically the realms of the complicated and the complex in those domains. And I think that what Cynefin has helped me to do that has been kind of difficult before I learned about the framework was to put together these pieces of knowledge about performativity and speech acts and dialectical theory and different types of philosophy in a way that other people can understand, because it is in a framework and has some definitions. And as we discussed, many people live in that obvious space, and it's really hard to move them out of that or to help that kind of transition occur without a sort of pre-existing framework. And I think that, we can get more into the transitional spaces a little later on in the conversation, and also the performativity spaces later on as well. But to me, this has been a helpful way of helping others understand those philosophical concepts as they relate to software testing.
Just to build on that, it's not even just the philosophy side. Even just in the retreat that we were at, the Cynefin retreat, a lot of the science behind this. I mean, he basically had faculty there from different academic circles. He had professors in, he touches on a lot of the natural sciences. He touches on biology. He touches on philosophy. He touches on social sciences. He often speaks of the area of anthro-complexity. There's a whole area of sense maker and sense making that where a lot of the data that Cognitive Edge uses in order to be able to have a better understanding of a complex adaptive system and how people should be looking at where the current disposition of the system is. That stuff is amazingly deep, and there's a lot going on there. This particular model is one that they've kind of layered on top of it in terms of how people may enter into the science, well, the sciences that he's touching on. But you're right, Jess. There's a lot going on there.
I think honestly, that's what attracted me to the framework, is that there is a lot going on in it. When I listened to Dave speak in New York earlier this year, I was really inspired because of the way that he wove science and philosophy and qualitative and quantitative research together, and the way that he was using SenseMaker to kind of help researchers do that. And I think that that's another piece of this that's important to kind of realize, is that it is kind of it's more than meets the eye. We're looking at this diagram, there's 4 parts. A lot of people are like, oh, yay. But really, it's this diagram that has so many layers, like an onion, to kind of pull apart and tease apart and work with. And I find that very, very helpful and attractive.
More than that, it's also fractal. It works at pretty much any granularity. You can use it as someone in the trenches doing exploratory testing. You can use it to be talking to a product manager. You can be talking to C-level, and the same rules, if you like, will hold. And so you're right, Jess, earlier when you were talking about communication, that it gives you a vocabulary to describe different kinds of complexity to people who aren't necessarily in that headspace in a way that they can understand it.
But wait, could I just check to see whether I'm sounding any better now?
Yes.
You are, but your breathing is incredible.
Is that any better?
Yes.
Maybe I had the mic.
Yeah, significantly better.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, I'm on my phone now, and I've closed down GoToMeeting on my laptop. Right.
One piece of bookkeeping here, by the way. I want to remind everyone that this is, and Dave's very specific about this, that he refers to this. We've called it a model a couple times. We've called it a diagram. He definitely refers to Cynefin intentionally as a framework. Something to be, something to be built upon. But he will actually go out of his way to correct someone, and he will go to great lengths to explain why. So that's something that we may want to keep in mind when discussing it in this call.
Well, in fact,
for sure,
right? By talking about liminality and by drawing the diagram quite differently, it's not a fixed model, and that's also really important.
Yeah, its ability to accept change, I guess, and to be dialectical in holding 2 things as possible. This exists and something else could exist. I think that's a really important piece. And when I said like picture earlier, I mean, you couldn't see my air quotes that I made, but I said it in the air quote kind of way, because a lot of people who don't understand the framework, who don't understand its potential application and testing, would likely look at it and view it not as a framework, but as kind of like an infographic. So I guess that was more my intention, and I apologize. That came off just a little bit flippant, I suppose.
Just to be clear, no, it didn't come off flippant at all. It was just something I thought of when I heard a couple of different terms and remembering a few things from this past few days.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
I find Cynefin particularly useful with helping to shape my worldview, thinking about software engineering as a discipline. But Ben and Martin, you've made some really interesting points about how it can be used effectively at a much more detailed level, at day-to-day level within testing. Is that something you'd like to expand upon?
You can go first if you want, Ben.
Actually, I was going to say the same to you. The parallel testing thing is probably a good thing to bring up at this point.
Yeah, that's not a bad example. It's funny because this one actually touches a bit on where Dave's going a bit with liminal Cynefin as well. I mean, I've done a fair bit of experimentation outside the workplace, but also I've started doing a bit more experimentation in the workplace to sort of see how this may come in useful. And there's actually, I'm trying to right now nudge Elizabeth Zagroba and somebody else who she works with, Humble, to propose a talk explaining something that they did in their workplace around doing parallel paired test sessions. And the idea here was when they were actually going into, so this is definitely, I was nudging them, pulling up from Cynefin here, but the idea of going into an area we had already introduced, and people were getting quite good at building test charters and running test sessions, and working in pairs was a much better way in terms of taking session notes. But it was always quite difficult to sort of establish how well you understand an area, how have you set your charter so large that you're potentially heading down a single path, or are you actually appropriately sizing out the area so that you know you are properly testing it and learning about the system under test? So we started running these, and this is right out of approaches coming out of the complex domain, that rather than having a single group doing it, we would actually have two groups with the exact same test charter starting off at the same time, performing paired test sessions, taking notes for the same period of time, and then they would go off and do these in parallel and then send each other test reports after, describing what they've done, their session notes, what they discovered. And this is that ability to sort of hold you at the limit to recognize, are you ready to go in and start applying very, very good tactical dives of testing into this area or not? Because if these two test sessions diverged tremendously, it gave you a sense that maybe there's a lot more in this area and there's a lot more exploring that needs to be done to identify how you should be testing it and what you should be looking for. If these two test charters actually naturally ended up testing the exact same content, when you look at the two of them and you made the same sorts of decisions as to what to explore, it gave you a sense that it was very clear what the system should be behaving like in that area and how you should approach testing it. And if you want to go deeper, you can now put in better constraints and actually slide towards the complicated area and actually do very, very tactical dives into this area to get to the guts of how it's working. So that's one example of how we were using it.
Wow.
So which came first, the framework or the use?
In this case?
Yeah.
Well, this was me now having been over a year of bouncing around complexity theory. So I would say at this point, the framework.
Okay.
So were you trying to gain a better understanding of whether you should be in the complex domain or the complicated one, or were you trying to move the problem from complex into complicated?
The reality here is,
define,
sorry, go ahead.
Clarify, sorry.
No, go ahead, James. Sorry.
Were you trying to clarify your understanding of the problem rather than trying to move towards solving it?
I think it's, if you want to look, I mean, what we said earlier about the complicated domain, it's the area of experts, right? It's the area of expertise. And it's quite funny, when we talk about the Cynefin model to some people in the testing community, the immediate response, especially in the context-driven testing community, is, well, obviously we live in the complex. And the reality is that's not true. That's totally not true. We actually often apply expertise and methods and the way that we go about testing something, skills that we've learned. That is very much, you've decided to now constrain the problem, apply skills you have, do some analysis, knowing that it is a method by which you can learn more about the system. When you're doing that, you're no longer applying heuristics. And I would go so far as to say I think we use the term heuristics a little bit too loosely. There are times where people tend to take the same approach over and over and over again for most every problem and say, I'm using a heuristic. I'm like, well, to me, that's borderline a checklist at this point. You're sliding into disorder. However, the choice to use the appropriate approach to test a problem is the type of thing that you do when you have a sense of what sort of things you may get out of that form or that approach to solve that problem. The idea of what we're trying to do here was to use approaches that we have to identify whether or not the space that we've actually decided to test is discrete enough that we know what we're looking for, or if in fact we've actually tried to cut out too broad an area of the product to test, and whether or not we need to narrow it down further and select the appropriate methods to test. So it is a probing form of testing to identify whether or not we're ready to actually say, what is it that we need to test discretely? What is it we need to do deep testing on? Or are we still actually splashing around a bit, trying to identify where our targets are and how we should go about testing it? I hope I didn't ramble on too long there.
Right. So it was interesting that you called them parallel tests. Would you have considered these as being equivalent to the parallel safe to fail experiments that Dave Snowden recommends for understanding more about the problem in the complex domain?
It's exactly that.
Because it's low energy apart from anything else. I mean, what is failure there, right?
That's correct.
You haven't expended a whole lot of energy and you've gained information.
And it's the type of information you're getting from the endpoints too, right? The very people who you're asking to test it now become amazed that two pairs of intelligent testers, when given the same charter, found that they took their early decisions as to what to do, took them in completely different directions, and then they themselves realized there's a lot more in this space that they potentially have to explore. That's information that can feed back to the engineering team to say, there's a lot more testing that's needed before we actually converge on the idea that this area has been fully tested.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it might take a similar approach, and I have with teams when you have an unknown system or a whole lot of integrated systems where you want to know just how buggy this thing might be. So you do a very fast push end to end, for example. And you might have different teams doing it or different people doing it, but you're trying to get information very quickly about what nature of bugs you're dealing with and well, just how buggy it is. I work with clients who are often buying in systems. So they may go into those systems with very little knowledge. Exploratory testing might or might not be something that they're comfortable with or that they want to do, particularly if they're regulated, like if they're in public safety. But they need to gain information quickly about how good this vendor is, what sorts of problems they might be dealing with, and so on.
And do you ever use the Cynefin framework or the vocabulary of the Cynefin framework to explain that approach?
Not yet, no.
Do you think it might be useful for that?
It could be very useful for that, but you know, I didn't have it available to me when I was doing those things.
I'm actually going to throw Ben under the bus right now because he's got a really good example of how he, for example, completely did use the Cynefin network for explaining this approach without anybody being aware of it.
Cool.
Thanks, Mike. Good on you. Actually, this was what I was referring to earlier when I said I used Cynefin as a way to sort of organize stuff into, that's what I'm looking for. It doesn't matter. Essentially, what I did was take a group that was struggling with their project, and they were lost on a particular point or a particular area of functionality that they just weren't getting completed, and everything else was sliding. And so essentially, what I did was break down their backlog, and say, look, out of this backlog, out of the stuff that you have to deliver, what is the stuff that you know enough to do within your team right this second? And put those things up first. Out of what's left, what do you need? What do you know that you can do, but you need to kind of analyze first, or maybe pull on an expert somewhere, put that stuff in next. Everything else, we'll call that our backlog for now. So out of the first two sections, we prioritized what was the highest bits of value to work with first. And so what you end up with is initially a list of sort of obvious and complicated style problems ranked in order of value that the team can get started on immediately. Everything else that's left is essentially a complex problem. And so once we had something that part of the team could go and work on, part of the team went and started working on that stuff immediately. And for those that were left in planning, we looked at the complex problems that remained and said, okay, are there any parts of this problem that we can work on immediately? Let's break that stuff out. And for the stuff that remains, let's look at who we need to discuss this stuff with, who we need to sort of retask or have reprioritized, and sort of start to dig in there. But rather than have the team sort of be focused on this one thing they were trying and failing to deliver, we essentially went through the backlog and really just categorized the entire backlog in terms of how it fits into Cynefin.
I guess I would argue, Ben, that I've done very similar things long before I learned about Cynefin, and I've seen other teams do very similar things. So to me, it's not like it's a new approach.
No, in fact, it's an approach that
it provides a vocabulary for talking about those things, and it provides an air of respectability, if you like. Because
and in this particular case, it was just a way for me to organize my thoughts. It was a way for me to retask the team. I didn't mention Cynefin to them once,
right.
but it's a way to approach problem solving in I guess a different way than you might otherwise.
Right, and to some extent, what we're doing is attempting to reduce uncertainty.
At least manage it.
Yeah, something that really appeals to me about Cynefin is, well, when I started off in development, when I had responsibility for my own little project, I approached them. I didn't know what I had to do, and so I would play around and experiment and probe to find out more. And I think that is a rather difficult approach to justify to management, to expect clarity and clear plans and expect you to know exactly what you're going to do as you start off. But you can't say for sure, and so you end up just guessing and coming up with plans that you know bear no relation to what you will do, but make you appear professional and responsible.
Right.
Whereas Cynefin appeals to me because it makes it clear that the approach that many people instinctively feel is right for approaching software development, you can't understand the problem till you've started playing with it. Cynefin helps you to justify that, and it's particularly important, this move, the dynamic in between complex and complicated, because Cynefin can help you to explain that these experiments aren't just playing around. They're not just a matter of compensating for your ignorance. It's a matter of addressing the reality that it's a complex problem that's constantly changing and that you need to find out more about so that you can manage the problem. And this dynamic where you're moving from complex to complicated is really important, because these experiments, these safe-to-fail experiments, are a way of identifying ways that will help you to manage the problem, so that you can turn it from a complex problem that's difficult to get a handle on to one that is actually more manageable, because you've learned enough about it to manage it, to constrain the problem, so that you can then treat it as being a more conventional, manageable problem. And Cynefin can help you justify that, to explain that you need to acknowledge the uncertainty at the start. You need to experiment so that you can then manage the problem, and that you cannot simply jump in and pretend that it's a well-defined problem before you know enough to say anything concrete about it.
Yeah, that's right. I think there's a kind of a stigma attached to saying I don't know in the software development industry. If you say I don't know, then,
yes, even though that's the honest and responsible
decision makers are likely to say, well, I'll go and yes, and so the response tends to be, well, I'll go and talk to someone that does. And what I like about Cynefin is it gives you a way to say I don't know in a way that's actually okay, in a way that you can back up. I don't know, and in order to work this out, we need to do X, Y, and Z.
Right.
Yeah, it makes it clearer that the people who say they don't know are the honest, responsible ones, and the people who say, yeah, I've got a firm handle on this, are more likely to be bullshitters.
Right. One thing I do need to say also is credit where credit is due. The exercise I described based very closely on something that fellow Aussie Kim Ballestrin mentioned in a talk that she gave a while back. So I guess we can put links in notes later. I'll put that in.
I wouldn't mind just building on what James was just saying right now, and also touching a bit on this notion of uncertainty, that I wouldn't say that the point of this is decreasing uncertainty, but at least exposing where uncertainty is justified. It's more about demonstrating that the uncertainty exists, because the reality is the hope and the desire of anybody who's trying to run a project is having that certainty. They can't help but love it. It appeals to them, that idea that we've done this before, therefore we must be getting better at it. While as the reality of software is, anytime you're doing something the least bit innovative, it's innovative because it hasn't been done before. And that scares, well, James swore first, so I get to say it now. That scares the living shit out of people. That felt good. When James just spoke now about this idea of doing safe-to-fail experimentation, and then by that you're helping trying to define not so much necessarily how you may want to go about the problem, but getting a sense of what the problem itself may look like and what you do know and don't know about the problem. When Dave is now speaking about liminal Cynefin, what he's really emphasizing is the need to actually hold back. Once you actually start getting a sense of what this problem may look back, there is a tendency for people to converge, premature convergence on the solution. As soon as you see something, this may be the problem we need to address. This may be the approach for us to solving it. That's when teams would be, yeah?
Martin, you referred to liminal Cynefin. Perhaps you could explain what you mean by liminal, what the phrase means and how it relates to Cynefin.
I think it'll work a bit with the way I'm explaining it now, actually.
Right.
But I mean, what Dave's really, okay, well, I'll continue with the example I have now, and then we'll see if I can expand upon that. That idea of when you go through these experiments, when you go through something, and as you're actually getting a sense, a bit of a direction, so you're going through these dynamics, these cycles that Dave has described of cycling, say, between complex and complicated. there is a tendency to start to see a pattern emerges. You start to identify where you can put the constraints to solve the problem. And now you're going through a transition phase. This is a very important time when looking at uncertainty, where people may now say, we can see an approach, we can see how we want to pursue this. And you could see a team building a sprint to go ahead and build the solution. Dave is now identifying this transition phase as being a very key important part, because if you try to hold yourself as you're at that boundary between complex and complicated, or if you're doing shallow dives in the chaotic, as long as possible, to actually not miss other opportunities, because the lure of premature convergence is very, very strong. When you see a way to get out of the woods, you take it. It may not be the best way. Mm-hmm. And as this applies to the software testing community, I think this is one that can really change the definition of how we fit in R&D, more specifically on the R side, really helping the company identify when is the right time to actually converge on the solution, and are there other things to be explored. Dave's whole, I mean, there's quite long, if you actually ever go through his webcast on liminal Cynefin, the safest word I can use to describe it is it's a complete mindfuck. It's very hard to wrap your head around, but this particular piece of it is quite useful to understand. The idea of trying to consider the transition state itself as almost its own domain. We are now in the transition state where we can see a way to make a problem complicated versus complex based on putting in constraints. What else can you explore? So what else can you identify?
Can't you then take those potentially constraints as experiments?
Sorry, I heard two things being said. I don't know. I couldn't hear either of them clearly.
Okay, so
if Fiona, go ahead.
One of the things you might do is, if you were rushing too soon to a solution, would be to say, okay, now we think we can put this constraint in place, and then we can carry on, because now we understand enough about this. We think we know where we're going. But you could, in fact, to stay approximately where you are, identify some constraints that you could potentially put in place and set up more parallel experiments, more safe to fail experiments, in fact.
Yeah, I think that's it exactly.
I think
I just want to kind of simplify things a little bit. Hang on a second. I just wanted to step back. For those who aren't quite as familiar with the Cynefin framework, I wanted to call out the boundaries for a second. And so you'll notice that the disorder in the center kind of extends to the corners of the framework as well. And that's an important thing to understand about the framework itself. As you transition from any one domain to another, you are transitioning through disorder. And in liminal Cynefin, it calls out those borders, particularly between complex and complicated and complex and chaotic, as places where liminality is something that you may want to A, pay attention to, and B, be quite deliberate in using.
I think that it's important to understand where liminality comes from in order to have the clarity to then understand how it applies, because I think that Cynefin and liminality are both concepts, and liminality is not a framework, but Cynefin is, and they both require some mental attention. So liminality was defined in the late 1800s as the ambiguity or disorientation that occurs in the middle stage of a ritual. So for example, an example of this is getting married, a wedding. So there are three parts to that were identified and first used to kind of describe this in 1909. So you've got the separation from the prior way of being. So for the wedding example, I was the fiance and I'm getting ready to walk down the aisle. For our software testing example in Cynefin, I am in the complicated and I'm getting ready to examine some other aspects of the problem. Then you have the liminal period. So in our wedding example, that's the actual wedding. You're not a fiance anymore, but you're not yet a bride in that marriage. And then when you perform the speech act of I do, and then the priest or the pastor or whoever performs the ritual of, okay, you're married, then you are in the final, you're out of the liminal period and into the new phase. So in our example, out of that barrier and into the complex, or perhaps having slipped into chaos. So I just think it's important to understand that this comes from anthropology, and it's already it's a concept that's being borrowed, and as such, there are things about it that I think need some awareness and attention as we attempt to apply it to the framework.
Thank you for that, Jessica. I think that's really useful, providing that background and that explanation of what liminality is, because the word that will be unfamiliar to most people, and the concept too, and I think it could be particularly useful in software development and in testing, because I can just picture a project manager barking at developers and testers after acquiring a shallow understanding of Cynefin and saying, come on, where are we? Are we complex or are we complicated? Come on, make up your mind. And this idea of liminal Cynefin will be quite useful to be able to explain that it's not simply a matter of being in one or the other, that you have to understand what's going on in that transitional phase, and it's important to hold yourself there till you understand just what's going on, or to get rather till you've got a better understanding of what's going on, rather than thinking it's simply one or the other, and you have to be clear about which one you're in, because project managers do like that sort of arbitrary clarity, even though it's often really rather misleading and it's not connected to the reality of what's going on.
Yeah, I think I find that to be very true in my experience, and also quite a bit fake. And I think the reason being is that liminal spaces are anxious spaces. There's a natural anxiety because we live in worlds and societies, multiple societies, that say black or white, yes or no, make a choice. And when you're in the liminal space, or you're holding two ideas to be true, for example, somebody did something horrible to me in my childhood and I've forgiven them and I love them. That's an example where you have to hold two things to be true and accept. And it's very, similar in the liminal space. There's a great anxiety for people, especially when you've got a project manager standing over you, and as a development team, you're like, but wait, we're neither here nor there. We're figuring it out. And there is a great anxiety. There is a great desire to go to one pole or the other pole, and that's a more than just a practice. It's an exercise in mental. I don't want to say like fitness, but I don't really have the word to describe that. But I do think it is a mental exercise that requires practice and attention. It isn't just you can't just say, oh, we do Cynefin like that. I don't think it works that way if it's working.
In fact, I don't think there's such a thing as, there is no way to do Cynefin. It's not a thing. It's
What's really going to break their brain though is when you say, we're kind of in that in-between state, and actually that's the most valuable state for us to be in right now. We've got to scan more widely and look at more stuff. We're going to chill out here for a while.
Yeah, and that's not you being indecisive or stalling. It's being realistic.
I think the whole thing about holding on to uncertainty as a state is a mental exercise, and it's difficult. It's difficult for anybody. It's particularly difficult for the people, of course, whose money's riding on it.
Yeah, well, in software development, it's often been easier to promise to deliver at a reasonable cost and then to go way over budget than it's been to be honest up front about what it will cost.
Yeah.
This is an interesting area because we brought in project managers into this, and I do think there's going to be, and I've been actually, it's funny, this is an area I've been talking about for a while now, and it's interesting that there's some science that's kind of magically appeared in my life to kind of help me have this discussion. But I really do think that software testers as a society, as a group, as a people, as a self-identified members of people building software, we kind of owe it to project management to help them get out of the mess they're stuck in, because the tools that have been created for them are all enabling them to be entirely measured on precision based on when did something get delivered as close as possible to some date that we guessed at a long time ago. And this is how they're being measured for doing a good job. Then we in turn look back at them later on and say, well, you know, they're the ones who are holding us to this deadline. They're the ones who, but we've kind of left them out in the cold, that they're the one person who doesn't have the technical ability to actually estimate on the project, but they're the ones who are actually called good or bad project managers based on those estimates and based on how a project rolls out. As a society, as a group, as a community, one of the things I think is going to be a challenge for us is actually helping the project management side of things be able to change the equation so that they are now being asked to be communicators and being people who can actually divulge the truth of how a project is going, and not be people who are measured based on those estimates and based on those timelines. I think that's one of the challenges that we have in front of us.
I think that's been a challenge from the word go. That's not new.
Well, let me reframe. It's a challenge that I think we need to step up to help them with, and not simply say, you guys need to figure this out.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I've been doing that all my career, and I suspect most testers have.
Okay.
I guess I think the issue there comes in, from my point of view, from an assessment situation. Everybody wants shitty metrics so they can figure out how somebody else is doing. They don't want to actually investigate and know, because it's a time suck, right? So if you can look at a board and get an estimation for how many story points went through, and report that to the project manager, who can report that to the CTO, who can report that to the CEO, that's what people are caring about. So I think that, yeah, I mean, on the one hand, we do have to help, but on the other hand, there's a real paradigm and cultural shift that needs to happen about assessment. And I say that because I experience it a lot in schools, but I also experience it a lot in startups and in companies, where it's just about, okay, what can you tell me? And you can give them fake numbers and they're fine. They don't actually care, like, as long as it represents something that is similar to what they are seeing in the reality. So I think that the obsession with metrics and assessing in something that would kind of relate to this quote obvious domain, when really what we're looking at is at least a complicated communication of what's happening, or probably a view into the complex. How do you reduce that to a number on a sprint board?
And just to clarify, this isn't just the obvious. This is everything on the right side has that sense of cause and effect. Everything on that whole right side has that belief that you can put numbers to it and predict it.
But that's how project managers are trained. If you look at PMI training, if you look at how project management evolved post Manhattan Project, that's how they're trained. That's how they're trained to think. So I think one of the ways we can help them is to encourage them to look at the fact that software development is about uncertainty. That is, after all, where they began. But I don't know. There's a whole paradigm that they are operating in that's quite different from the one that we try to operate in.
Yeah, I was quite encouraged just the other day when I saw the evidence that the chief executive of HMRC gave to a committee of MPs at the House of Commons in London. HMRC, that's the UK's tax authority, tax body. And he was talking about the huge IT investment that would be required following Brexit, or to enable Brexit. And he told the MPs that technology projects are complex by nature, unforeseen things happen, and he wasn't prepared to commit to everything being fine and dandy. And I thought that was quite brave of him, because typically in the past he'd have been saying, yep, it's a tough problem, but we'll do it. And he'd have nailed his colours to the mast, and then would simply have booted people all the way down the line to get them to try and deliver the undeliverable. But he was saying up front, no, there are going to be big problems and we might not be able to do it on time. And that was quite reassuring to see that level of honesty. And okay, it might still be a disaster, but I feel slightly more optimistic about it, seeing some sense of realism from the guy at the top. Because if you get project managers and the business understanding that they're not operating all the time in these complicated and obvious domains, and they've got to allow for complexity, then that should, I hope, create a bit more freedom for the developers and the testers to do an effective job.
Mm-hmm. But I think we have to, if we're going to help to create that space, I think that we have to go beyond project managers into senior management.
Mm-hmm. Yes, because the project managers are simply responding to the pressures that are being imposed on them. It's not that they don't create this problem. You know, they're a victim of it as much as anybody else.
Mm-hmm.
But it's their responsibility to, I think, to understand the true nature of the problem and to communicate that, rather than to accept their fate passively.
That's still tough.
Yeah, it is.
But it's good. Cynefin is extremely valuable for enabling that conversation, for helping to educate people. And I'm sure it's a very effective starting point for explaining why a traditional mindset is inappropriate. If you got the chance to sit down for an hour or so with somebody who's not really tried or had to try and think their way through this, it's a good way to try to open some mental doors.
Mm-hmm. So, Martin, have you, and Ben, have you had success in actually interesting managers, senior managers in Cynefin, and in communicating it to them as a respectable framework?
To be honest, I almost can't help but feel it's a bit like the whole Hitler thing. If you actually use Hitler in an argument, you've lost. To win an argument, I almost feel if I actually have to say Cynefin, I've kind of lost in what I'm trying to do, because I'm finding it far more valuable to simply work in a certain way, demonstrate via examples and narratives, and have people trying to learn a bit more about my approaches, and then try to emulate the some aspects of how I'm working, rather than actually trying to say, here's a framework, you should use it, it works really well. I find that one's, once again, saying, hey, I've got this hammer, everything's now a nail, why don't you go ahead and use it? It takes a while before people get comfortable. It takes a while before people try to understand how it fits into their problem sets. And so I've been more behaving in a certain way and seeing if people choose to pay attention and follow along with me. And I have seen quite a few. I wish it was the type of thing I could do quickly, but for that to be the case, I would need the types of decision makers and people who hold the money purse strings being the ones that I'm communicating to directly. And since I'm not at that level anywhere I'm working, then I have to work within my realm of influence only.
Right, and I think that's always been true for us. And as testers, we don't always have access to the same corridors of power.
I can say something though that I think is interesting. As I mean, almost everybody on this call does. Some of you are consistently coaching, mentoring, guiding people. Some of you are doing it sometimes. I'm one of those people who just kind of does it sometimes. But there are aspects of coaching people on good software testing and coaching people on context-driven testing where some of what I've been learning through complexity theory has really helped better explain why it might be good. It's really helped paint a clearer picture as to what really the opportunity might be for a critical thinker in the role of a software tester, and one that's a bit more compelling than sometimes just kind of drive home the idea of that is testing or that's not testing.
Right.
And I think that's a space that I think is a very, very important tie-in to the Cynefin framework and complexity theory and SenseMaker, for that matter, that I think getting some of the brightest people involved in software to start taking an interest into thinking critically about software as an explorer might be very, very helpful to the craft.
I think it would be very valuable.
Yeah, agreed. So I want to echo Martin's comments on sort of usage of Cynefin and speaking to sort of decision makers about it. I tend not to bring up the framework. I mean, I spent some time last week speaking to some software testers who were eager to learn about Cynefin. I had half an hour to try and get through it. I managed most of the 5 domains. Didn't get anywhere close to boundaries and dynamics and attractors. So the sort of time that you get to actually speak with sort of high-level decision makers, is far less than that. So being able to talk in terms of helping them understand how software development is complex, and sort of bringing up, well, is there ever a time when you have done the same project twice, or if you had any given project, would you do it exactly the same way a second time? The answer is always no, and so inevitably they have to admit that we learn stuff as we go. We can't plan everything up front. So there is an element of complexity inside software development, and we need to account for it. We need to plan for it. And so being able to explain complexity to sort of high-level execs in a way that they get it is something that Cynefin has given me, despite the fact that I'm not using Cynefin specifically to explain it to them.
I guess I'm going back to where I came from, which is I've been trying to do that for 40 years, almost 40 years, to get people to understand that software development is not about proceeding in a linear way to a predetermined outcome, and that testing is necessarily an activity that helps to expose uncertainty. Uncertainty.
Yeah, I'd agree, and I think that
I'm not saying that Cynefin's not an interesting thing to learn about. I'm not convinced it's taking us any further.
I just want to be able to tie back on some of the things Jessica said earlier. I can tell you that I sort of stopped thinking about Cynefin itself quite a while ago, and I've been spending all my time looking at a lot of the background science that they're touching on. And for example, I've spent the last 6 months, and I need to be a little bit careful about how much I talk about it now, because I'm also, actually, Ben, you are too. We both signed it. We're both under NDA on some things that we can and can't talk about around SenseMaker, but looking at some of the tools that they use that allowed the Cynefin framework to evolve at the top level, those are things that I think can become deeply beneficial to the software testing community. And I'm continuing to experiment and explore more with these to see how we might be able to use these. They complement the context-driven testing, although, yeah, I'm starting to like the idea of calling it context-sensitive testing. I don't know about you, Ben.
Or that's probably closer to multiple context-sensitive, but that's just me.
Yeah. But these are the areas that I'm actually getting very, very fascinated with, because it's the way that they amass the data that might lead to good software testers with a CDT mindset. We would know to continue testing somewhere more. We would know to look deeper. We would know to spend more time in an area, but also be able to back up that kind of behavior with something a bit more concrete than piss off, I'm a good software tester, something that project managers would understand, something that engineering directors would understand. And so this is where I'm going to be spending a great deal of my time over the next 6 months, to be quite honest.
Okay. I mean, obviously I see the advantage of having a theoretical construct to help explain the things we know to be true. I guess my concern is that we do know those things to be true. We've known them for a long time. It's not advancing us in that regard. But if it can provide a theoretical construct and a language and a vocabulary for communicating better about those things.
Do we need to be careful when we're talking about it, about using the word Cynefin and trying to ensure that our audience don't think of it as being a new method, a new tool, something that they can buy and then plug in and will provide them with a magic solution?
Well, that's the problem all along, right? I mean, it's going back to what Martin said about the hammer and the nail. The project managers already think they've got a hammer, and as to the people who run companies,
they don't see it as being a way of better understanding their job, but as an alternative way to conduct it. And so they might evaluate it fleetingly and say, well, no, I'm quite happy with the way I'm working, rather than seeing it as a better way of understanding what they're trying to do.
Do you guys mind if I just jump in real quick?
Who's this?
So, I don't think it feels a little bit like we're beating up on project managers. I never thought I would defend project managers, but how I think about Cynefin is it's more about situational awareness. So it's not really saying that the way that they work is bad and wrong. It's more well, the way I use it anyway, it just kind of tells me that the way that they may use their current tools in all situations isn't a good idea, but in some situations it is actually the right thing to do. So definitely the mistake I made before I started to get my head into this was I guess I was biased to thinking that everything was complex or the complex domain was the best domain, and that the obvious domain was the worst domain. And I don't think it works like that. I think it more works like if your actions and behavior don't suit the situation that you're in, or i.e. the domain that you're in, that's the thing that's bad.
Right.
So it's not about telling project managers that they're completely useless and they're doing everything wrong. It's more saying, okay, when we really understand the context and everything is really super obvious, then we can use all those tools that you've got. They're actually pretty awesome, but we're not always in that situation, so we should reach for some different tools.
And to be fair,
I defended them, Brennan.
Know that. And
I apologize.
there are some very good project managers out there who are not mentally constrained. Constraints in a slightly different sense here. Who are not mentally constrained by the way they were trained. Who understand that they have to factor context in, and they have to behave differently in different contexts.
But yeah, I was just going to say, I think Vernon touched on a very important point here, especially for us or people who identify as coming from the CDT testing community. That one thing about Cynefin that is really valuable, I think, is it shows people that. I mean, some people misunderstand CDT to mean exploratory testing is the best practice, or treating problems as complex problems is the way to go. And and for me, that studying Cynefin has, like you mentioned, Vernon, it has sort of retaught me to value the tools that would in some cases be considered like best practices or yeah, such a simple thing as test cases. Yeah, they have their use, and I know this, and like you said, Fiona, as well. We all of these things we've probably known for a long time, but some things become now not only intuitive for me, at least with Cynefin, but helps me look at it and explain it in maybe a different way, and also see how it connects. Different things connect with each other.
Somebody said this, I can't remember who it was, that we'd like to think everything is complex.
Yeah.
And I guess one of the things that Cynefin does is to say saying something belongs in a particular domain or is in a particular domain at the moment is not actually a value judgment.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah.
Complex is not better than complicated.
Exactly. Yeah. One domain is not better than another one.
Actually,
That's
two things.
The mistake I would make before I learn about it.
Two things I want to point out. One is we've lost Ben, just so you know that. Ben is no longer connected to this call. But I did want to touch also on something else based on what Vernon and Johan said, is that interestingly enough, one of the things that I've been using as a tool when someone's asking me specifically about Cynefin is very much along these lines, where people have this natural tendency. It's a human natural tendency to want to categorize things and want to know which one's best. And I've often been framing the questions when trying to talk about this with someone, rather than saying, well, which domain do you think this fits in? I would ask the question, all right, why would you treat this as a complex problem, and how would that be beneficial? If you were to treat this as a complicated problem, how would that change how you would think about it? Or if you were to treat it as an obvious problem, would that make sense? How could you do it? Like, what would be the advantages and disadvantages of treating this as if this were an obvious problem? It really helps have a much better conversation about thinking about problems in different domains than trying to say which one does it fit in, because ultimately a lot of this has more to do with how you choose to view the problem and how you perceive the problem and what you're prepared to do, rather than does it discretely, can you define it as one or the other? Because there's so much going on that you don't see anyway, that you can explore more about the problem just by having these conversations this way anyway.
Right, and those sound like a really good set of questions.
Yeah, those are some really metacognitive questions, getting testers, project managers, C-suite to think about our thinking, their thinking, our thinking around the problem space. The other thing I think that occurred to me as Fiona was talking was how do we use this to push forward? And I think that the metacognitive practice is one way that we can use it to push forward, by encouraging everybody to think about their thinking and their approaches. I also think that the Cynefin framework offers more of a way to talk about risk and ROI, because really C-suite, that's what they're interested in. I mean, we know that it's not a mystery. And when we can frame problems in terms of the kinds of risks and business impact, then we can, I think, more easily get agreement or move forward and communicate why we need something we need as testers, than if we take kind of a more philosophical approach on the issue, or a less sort of evidence-oriented or risk-oriented approach. So I do see that as a benefit of having the framework of discussion and some common language around that kind of thinking.
Totally spot on. I think the problem for me with this is that I think I start to understand a tiny bit of the theory, but then turning it into something real, like how does this change my behavior, my action, isn't always super duper straightforward. So if you kind of phrase it in the way that you've just been describing, that might help make that leap.
One of the things that I find really useful when we're talking about risk and talking about a framework like this is that not all software systems are equivalent. A lot of testers, a lot of software developers are working in business domains where there aren't very large risks. The risks might be specifically to their company, because if they don't succeed with their super duper software system, the company won't succeed. But in terms of the risks of the software itself and the impacts that it might have on the public, they might be quite minimal. So it can help to start framing some of those conversations about risk.
There's another point I wanted to, it's funny, each of you is built on it, so I can actually say less and less, which is great, thank you. Going back to the discussions with the C-levels, one very useful thing is, well, actually two very useful things, I guess would be, one is that the C-levels typically know all this. The C-levels are actually not the ones who are thinking the problem is discrete. They get to this point because they do understand a lot of this to be true. However, things like reporting on ROI is something that they have to do. It's not that they actually think that that's how discrete the problem is. They recognize that that's the type of thing that's demanded from shareholders. That's the type of thing that's demanded from people who are not necessarily experts in building software, but are the ones who are funding the building of software. And the other side of the coin here is that Dave and Cognitive Edge and Cynefin and other complexity theory specialists, they do have the ear right now of the C-levels. So the more that software testing aligns with a current science that is of interest at the executive level and at the high level public decision-making level in governments right now, the better we are positioned to have good discussions about why testing needs to be considered a critical thinking exercise and how we have to be more involved in the decision making and not simply just an end state of or a goal that you have to get past in order to say the project is done. And I think this actually opens up a lot of opportunities for us.
I'm gonna have to quickly say goodbye. I have to jump off the call now. But
thank you, Vernon.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me along. I think I've realized once again how much I don't know about this subject, so I need to do some more reading. I'll speak to you all online or in the flesh sooner rather than later, hopefully.
Take care, Vernon.
And I believe I'll see you soon, Vernon.
Take care,
Yeah.
man.
See you guys. Bye-bye.
Okay.
I think what Vernon said is really important. I mean, I'm very conscious that I'm a novice with this and only just trying to get my head around what it means, let alone how to use it.
Yeah, same here.
It's been a very useful discussion, and we've really only scratched the surface. There's so much more that we could have talked about, and it's important that people listening to this, or they don't come hoping that they'll be able to be taught all about Cynefin. I think all that we could realistically hope to do is to explain why we're interested, why we think it's relevant, and to encourage people to go away and find out about it for themselves and to think about how they might be able to apply it. It's really much too deep and significant, I think, to be able to go into in any great depth in just an hour or so. But I hope we've been able to encourage people to find out for themselves, to educate themselves about it.
One thing I should probably point out now then, if it's of interest to anybody who'd be listening to this conversation later, is that Cognitive Edge actually does have a sort of a membership type profile. There are a ton of webcasts over the years that they've done discussing different applications of this in different domains and some of the background science. And while you can mine through all the different blogs that they have available online, but access to the tools and access to the webcasts is actually not that much money annually. And so if someone really wants to start diving deep, there's ways to get started on it without having to immediately leap into one of the 4-day workshops or meeting with practitioners. I would highly recommend having a look.
Yeah, Dave Snowden and Cognitive Edge have put a huge amount out there for free on YouTube on the Cognitive Edge site.